Clara Voss set another flat stone into a wall barely high enough to reach her knee, while three ranchers watched from horseback and laughed at the goats gathered around her. Building them a parlor now, one man called. Clara pressed mud into the joint. Building where they stand. That brought more laughter from the trail above her claim. The shelter sat half buried beside a low ridge of stone and sage, its back pressed into the earth and its roof angled toward the open slope. No man could stand inside. Even a goat would have to lower its head. 10-year-old June crouched beside Clara with a basket of dry brush, packing sage stems into the gaps exactly as Clara had shown her. "Are they laughing because it is low?" June asked. "They are laughing because it is not theirs." Clara did not look up. Across the foothills, most livestock shelters stood tall enough for a rancher to walk through without removing his hat. Clara's structure faced sideways along the ridge, away from the upper pen where her 24 goats had slept every winter before. That pen had strong posts, a plank gate, and a clear view of the cabin. It also caught every northwest gust crossing the bare slope. For 9 evenings, Clara had watched the goats refuse it. They climbed toward the pen at feeding time, nosed the rails, then turned together and crowded beside this ridge. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the sage, backs to the open country. Even the young ones settled there without fuss. The men at the trading post said the herd had grown spoiled since Clara's husband died. One claimed she had let the animals forget discipline. Another said a widow had no business trusting livestock over experienced ranchers. Clara had heard them all. Her husband, Thomas, had disappeared in a whiteout 2 winters earlier, less than a mile from home. Men who had never searched that storm later told Clara grief had made her fearful of weather. She had stopped explaining herself after that. A shadow fell across the unfinished wall. Elias Boone had ridden down from the trail. He was a broad-shouldered sheep rancher with gray at his temples and a habit of inspecting work before offering an opinion. He dismounted and pressed one boot against the foundation. "This roof will sit below the drift line," he said. "That is the purpose. It may be buried by morning. Snow can block wind. It can block air, too." June stopped packing brush. Clara turned back to the wall. "There will be a rear vent. If the roof holds, it will." Elias studied the goats lying calmly around the site. "You could still move them into your upper pen." "I could, but you will not. Not while they keep leaving it." His gaze shifted from Clara to the ridge, then to the exposed slope above them. He said nothing more before mounting his horse. When he had gone, Clara drove 3 willow stakes beside the upper pen and 3 along the ridge. From her coat pocket, she took strips of red wool cut from an old winter scarf. June tied the lower ribbons while Clara tied the higher ones. Then they stepped back. At the upper pen, every strip snapped toward the southeast. One twisted so hard against its stake that fibers tore free. Beside the ridge, the highest ribbon trembled, but the lowest hung nearly still. June smiled. They knew. "They noticed," Clara said. "That is not the same as knowing why." She opened the notebook she kept inside an oilskin cover and drew the slope. Ridge. In 6 stakes. Dust stained the page beneath her thumb. By sunset, the first course of the wall was complete. Clara called the herd uphill for grain. The goats approached the trough, stopped, and raised their heads. Every animal turned toward the northwest at once. Then, with the sky still clear above them, all 24 goats left the upper pen and pressed against Clara's unfinished wall. Clara did not drive the goats back to the upper pen. She stood beside the unfinished wall while the herd pressed close enough for their breath to darken the stones. The youngest doe kept looking northwest, ears fixed towards something beyond the foothills. June followed the animal's gaze. "There is nothing there." "Nothing we can see," Clara said. She recorded the hour, the clear sky, the ribbons, and the goats' refusal to eat. Then she counted every animal before leading them to the cabin side of the ridge for the night. By morning, a thin veil of cloud had appeared over the mountains. Clara worked faster. The roof began with short willow poles laid from the ridge wall to the stone front. Across them she wove brush in crossing layers, then pressed mud and clay into the weave until no daylight showed through. June crawled inside to pack the rear corners. "It smells like wet sage," she called. "It will smell better than frozen boards." The shelter was long enough for 6 goats to settle without piling on one another. Clara needed 4 shelters before deep winter. She marked the first in her notebook, then drew 3 empty rectangles beside it. 4 shelters, 24 goats, less than 2 months before the valley usually saw its first blizzard. Elias returned near noon. He crouched at the entrance and looked into the dark interior. Warm enough, Clara waited. Too warm if the entrance closes. She pointed to a narrow opening beneath an angled slab at the back. Rear vent. Elias held one gloved hand near it and felt the faint current passing through. A drift could seal that too. Not from this side of the ridge. You are trusting the wind to behave. No, I am watching where it already does. He glanced at the notebook beneath her coat. Its oilskin cover was streaked with mud. Clara fitted another stone around the vent and angled it downward so falling snow could not enter directly. Then she placed a willow stake above it, marking where June should dig if the shelter vanished beneath a drift. The clouds thickened before supper. Wind crossed the upper slope in hard bursts, striking the pen gate until its iron latch rattled. Beside the ridge, the lower red ribbons moved only in brief shivers. Clara scattered a small measure of grain inside the shelter. 6 goats entered. The others gathered along the outer wall, using the ridge and the new roof as a windbreak. Rain came first, cold and slanted. Then the squall turned the drops to hard pellets that struck the cabin windows and rolled across the ground like pale seed. June watched from the doorway. Should we bring them into the shed? Not yet. The upper pen gate slammed hard enough to throw splinters from the post. Clara pulled on her coat and crossed the yard with June behind her. Inside the low shelter, the 6 goats remained dry. Their bodies had warmed the rear wall, and the mud roof did not leak. When Clara opened the entrance, cold air entered, but the temperature recovered before she finished checking the vent. Elias rode through the squall with his collar turned high. He had come to warn her about the weather, but stopped when he saw the goats resting beneath the ridge. The upper gate slammed again. One hinge tore partly free. Elias helped Clara secure it with rope. Neither mentioned the shelter until the wind weakened. Then he looked down at the calm animals. One squall does not prove a winter. No, Clara said, but it proves where I build the second one. After dark, she returned with a lantern to inspect the roof supports. Mud had blurred one corner of the wind map. Clara wiped it with her sleeve and crouched beside the central support. A thin line ran through the stone. She held the lantern closer. The load-bearing stone had cracked from top to bottom. The crack widened when Clara touched it. She lowered the lantern and pressed both palms against the roof beam. Nothing shifted, but the broken stone carried more weight than it should. If snow settled hard on the brush mat, the split could open without warning. June stood at the entrance in her nightdress and boots. Is it falling? Not tonight. Clara's answer was firm enough to keep fear out of the child's face, though she did not trust the stone through another storm. At first light, she emptied the shelter and took the roof apart, one muddy section at a time. The goats complained from the ridge, but none tried to enter the damaged structure. 2 ranchers passed on the upper trail and slowed. Winter already beat it, one called. Clara lifted the cracked support into the daylight. Bad weight line. Stone does not care about lines. It does when a roof leans on it. Instead of replacing it with another upright slab, Clara chose 2 shorter stones and angled them toward each other. She laid a flattened willow mat across their tops so pressure from the roof would spread toward both walls instead of driving through one narrow point. June held the stones steady while Clara packed clay around their bases. By noon, the shelter stood again. Clara loaded 4 grain sacks onto the roof, then added flat rocks until the brush poles bowed slightly and held. She wrote the result in her notebook. Mud had dried across the oilskin cover, and the page beneath her thumb carried a smear from the night before. 1 shelter strengthened, 3 still unbuilt. The repair had consumed nearly all the poles intended for the second roof. Clara and June took the handcart to the willow stand below the creek. The ground remained slick from the squall. Clara cut straight young poles, while June trimmed the branches. They had stacked half a load when hoofbeats sounded above the bank. Elias appeared with an empty drag sled behind his horse. "I saw your cart tracks," he said. "I did not send for help." "No." He examined the willow poles. "These will drag easier than they push." Clara almost refused him. Then she looked at June's muddy sleeves and the long climb back. "You can haul them," she said, "but you do not place them." Elias nodded. "Your shelter." At the ridge, Clara handed him 2 red wool strips. Hold one at your shoulder and one near your knee. He raised them beside the upper pen. Both streamed hard to the southeast. Clara moved him down slope and along the stone ridge. At shoulder height, the wool still pulled. At goat height, it softened until only the tip stirred. Elias changed position 3 times without being asked. The ridge lifts the worst of it, he said, and the sage breaks what comes around the sides. You measured this during the squall. Before it, he looked at the notebook. How many times? 9 evenings, 2 mornings, 1 squall. That answer quieted him more than any argument could have. They built the second shelter before sunset. Clara copied the reinforced support design and widened the rear vent by 2 fingers. Elias carried stone, but waited for her to choose each piece. When the roof was finished, Clara placed feed sacks across it, then added rocks until the load matched the first test. The walls held, the vents remained open. 6 goats entered and settled without crowding. Elias crouched beside the entrance. That is not kindness. Clara looked at him. It is engineering. June smiled before Clara could stop herself from doing the same. The warmth lasted only a moment. Clara carried fresh grain toward the trough. The herd followed, bells sounding softly. Then the lead doe stopped. One by one, all 24 goats passed the grain without lowering their heads. They crowded against the unfinished stretch of ridge where Shelter 3 should have stood, pressing so tightly that June could not step between them. Beyond the sage, the open ground looked empty. The air felt still. Every goat stared toward the northwest. Clara set the grain bucket down without calling the herd again. The goats stood packed against the unfinished ridge, heads low, bodies angled away from the northwest. Even the young buck that usually fought for the first mouthful had forgotten the trough. June touched Clara's sleeve. Do we start the third one now? Clara looked at the light. Less than 3 hours remained before dusk. Yes. They worked until their fingers stiffened. Shelter 3 went up faster because the design no longer had to be guessed. Clara placed the paired support stones, laid the willow mat across them, and cut the rear vent before the roof mud hardened. June packed sagebrush into the gaps while the goats watched from a few feet away. Elias returned near sunset with flat stones filling his wagon. I have more than my sheep need, he said. Clara examined the first slab. These came from your South Wash. They did. That is a long haul. So is replacing frozen stock. 2 ranchers had followed him from the trail. Neither laughed when Clara directed where the stones should be stacked. Elias lifted each piece only after she chose it. When one man suggested turning the 4th shelter toward the cabin, Elias shook his head. The wind does not come from her porch. By the next afternoon, Shelter 3 was sealed. Shelter 4 stood waist-high along the final stretch of ridge. Clara's hands were split at the knuckles, and the chimney stones beside the cabin remained unrepaired. But all 24 goats could now fit beneath completed roofs if they crowded. She refused to call that finished. The 4th shelter still needed its roof, vent, drainage lip, and entrance marker. June carried brush in both arms. Elias brought another sled of willow. No one called the work foolish now. They called it Clara's row. Men who had mocked the first knee-high wall began riding slower along the upper trail. Some studied the ribbons. Others watched where the goats stood before looking at the sky. When the final roof hardened, Clara performed the full test. June counted 6 goats into each shelter. Clara checked every rear vent with a strip of wool, cleared the drainage channels, and measured the air near the roofs, entrances, and back walls. Elias opened Shelter 2, let cold air enter, then closed the brush screen. The warmth returned quickly. All 4, he said. All 4 for now. You do not allow yourself much comfort. Comfort is not the same as ready. That evening, Elias stayed for stew. June explained how the shelter markers could be found under snow. Elias listened as if the lesson came from a grown ranch hand. When June went to add wood to the stove, he looked at Clara's cracked hands. You were right to watch them. Clara held her spoon above the bowl. The goats, he added, you were right to watch before you built. It was the first time anyone beyond June had said it plainly. Clara lowered the spoon. Watching does not promise the answer. No, but it gives a person a chance to ask the right question. For one quiet minute, the cabin felt larger than it was. Then the lead doe struck the wall outside with one horn. The herd had left the shelters. Clara reached the ridge to find all 24 goats gathered between the entrances. They would not return inside. They would not climb toward the pen. Every nose pointed northwest. The goats did not move. The highest red ribbon snapped hard. The lower one trembled twice, stopped, then pulled steadily in a direction it had not taken before. Clara opened her notebook beneath the lantern. She turned past the new wind maps to older pages written before mud stained the cover and before Thomas failed to come home. One page held the same sequence. Clear morning, still ground air, high ribbon turning first, animals refusing feed, northwest pressure before sundown. Clara read the date again. It was the morning Thomas had vanished into the whiteout. Clara kept the old page open beside the new one until the lantern flame bent in a draft. The dates were different. The pattern was not. She laid a ruler between them. On each page, the first change had come high above the ground. The second had come in the animals. The cold had arrived last. June watched her mark the sequence with charcoal. Does it mean another whiteout? It suggests one, like the one that took Uncle Thomas. Clara closed the notebook halfway. It does not prove that. At dawn, the sky remained pale and harmless. That made the ranchers bolder. 2 men rode down and found Clara clearing each drainage channel with a short-handled shovel. She checked the rear vents, tightened the brush screens, and pressed fresh mud over seams that had opened overnight. One man looked toward the empty upper pen. You mean to leave good fencing unused because goats missed breakfast? I mean to prepare before I need the answer. Boone says you keep records. I do. Paper will not stop weather. No, stone, brush, and the right ground might. The goats stood near shelter 4, refusing the grain June had poured into the trough. Their ears remained angled northwest. Clara tied fresh wool to the stakes. The upper strips pulled sharply. The lower strips along the ridge barely moved, except at the western end of shelter 4. There, the ribbon twisted around the willow stake and tore free. It vanished across the sage before June could catch it. Clara inspected the shelter. The western roof lip had loosened where the mud had dried too quickly. If wind caught beneath it, the entire edge could peel upward. She sent June for clay and began removing the weakened section. Sometimes people decide who is sensible before they examine what that person has seen. Then every warning sounds like fear, and every careful act looks foolish. Have you ever noticed something important, only to be dismissed because others had already chosen not to trust your voice? Hoofbeats came hard from the trading road. Elias rode into the yard with frost whitening his horse's mane. He dismounted before the animal had fully stopped. The temperature dropped 12 degrees between the ford and Miller's Rise. He said, Cloud Bank is moving behind the northwest ridge. Clara pointed to the goats. They stopped eating yesterday. Elias looked at the opened roof. What do they tell you now? It was the first time he asked without challenging the answer. That the ground wind has changed. The stronger air is still passing above us, but it is turning. When it drops, it will strike the upper slope first. How long? I do not know. Elias nodded. Tell me what to carry. They repaired shelter 4 with doubled willow along the western edge. Clara angled flat stones across the roof lip, then buried the joint beneath clay and brush. June counted 24 bells. Clara checked each strap before fastening one around every goat's neck. If snow erased the ridge, the bells would give her direction and count. She tied one guide rope from the cabin porch to the first shelter marker. A second rope went beside her coat. The shovel, spare brush, and iron bar rested near the door. By mid-afternoon, frost had stiffened the surviving red ribbons. The notebook pages curled beneath Clara's damp fingers. The valley still looked quiet. A rancher on the trail called that the weather might pass north. Clara moved 6 goats into each shelter, then reopened the entrances when they grew restless. The animals came out, circled once, and gathered close to the ridge without climbing toward the pen. Elias watched them. You are staking your whole herd on this place. My herd chose it before I understood it. And if the shelters fill, we clear the vents from the lee side. If the ridge disappears, we follow the rope and bells. If the goats refuse to enter, Clara looked at the upper pen, its repaired gate standing against the exposed slope. Then I do not force them into danger because a fence looks familiar. The first gust arrived without snow. It struck the upper pen hard enough to bow the posts. The gate slammed once, twice, then tore from its lower hinge. Beyond the foothills, the clear air turned white. The blizzard reached Clara's claim before sunset, and she had only moments to choose between shutting 24 goats inside the failing pen or opening it and letting them walk into the storm. Clara did not close the broken gate. She pulled the upper latch free, stepped aside, and let the goats decide. For one breath, the herd remained packed against the rails while snow swept sideways through the opening. Then the lead doe lowered her head and walked into the whiteout. The others followed without scattering. 24 bells moved down the slope in one steady line. "June," Clara called. The girl stood in the cabin doorway with a blanket around her shoulders. "You stay inside. Keep the stove fed. Mark the time I leave, and every time a bell count changes." June's chin tightened. "I can help dig." "You help by making sure I come back with the same number I took out." June caught Clara's sleeve before she turned away. "You are not spoiling them." The wind pressed the blanket against the girl's narrow shoulders. "You listened when they were trying to tell us," June said. "So I will listen for you." Clara placed a gloved hand over June's and held it there for one brief second, then listened carefully. She gave her the cleanest remaining notebook page and a pencil. Then she tied one guide rope around the porch post and ran it through her gloved hands toward the first willow marker. Elias fastened the second rope around his waist. "I go behind you," he said. "You stay on the line. If I lose the ridge, pull twice. And if I lose you, follow the bells, not my tracks." The goats had already vanished, but their bells remained low and close together. Clara moved toward the sound, one hand on the rope and the other shielding her face. The first shelter marker appeared only when she struck it with her knee. Snow had gathered against the entrance, but the rear vent remained clear. 6 bells sounded inside. Clara touched each animal as she counted. 1 through 6. Elias repeated the number toward the cabin. Faintly, June called it back. The second shelter held 6 more. The third entrance was buried to its roofline, yet the goats inside were calm. Their body heat had softened the snow around the brush screen. At shelter 4, the western roof lip had disappeared completely. Clara dropped to her knees and dug with the short shovel. Wind filled each cut almost as quickly as she made it. Elias drove the iron bar beneath the packed drift and lifted while she pulled away blocks with both hands. A rush of warm air escaped. 4 goats pushed their noses through the opening. 2 more bells answered from deeper inside. 18 through 24, Clara said after counting twice. Elias sent the number along the rope. From the cabin, June's voice came thin but clear. 24 accounted for. The words struck Clara harder than the wind. For 2 winters, every white sky had carried the memory of a man who had not returned. Now June had given her a count, a place, and a reason to keep moving. The goats had chosen correctly, but the storm was not finished testing them. Snow began sealing the rear vent of shelter 4. Clara crawled around the lee side, using the willow marker to find the stone channel beneath the drift. Her notebook slipped from inside her coat and landed open in the snow. She snatched it up, but water had already soaked the exposed pages. Charcoal lines bled across the paper. The old whiteout record blurred into the new one. Clara shoved the notebook beneath her coat and dug until cold air moved through the vent again. Elias packed brush along the western edge. "Roof is holding. For now." The guide rope jerked against the stone corner. Once, then again. Clara caught it before the fibers parted. The rope had begun to fray where it rubbed across the ridge. She shifted it into a shallow groove and wedged flat stones around it. Her hands had grown too numb to feel the knots, so Elias tightened them after she placed them. A bell sounded beyond the 4th shelter. Clara stopped. It was deeper than any bell in her herd. Another answered farther downslope. Then 5 more rang through the snow. Elias turned toward the sound. "Those are sheep bells." Clara listened. The bells multiplied beyond the ridge, scattered at first, then gathering into one frightened chorus. There were dozens of them, far more animals than Clara owned. Clara kept one hand on the guide rope and moved past shelter 4. The strange bells sounded from the lee side of the ridge, where the ground fell into a shallow hollow. Snow crossed above it in long white sheets, but near Clara's knees the air moved with less force. Elias followed with the iron bar and spare brush. "Stay inside the ridgeline," Clara said. "Do not climb toward the sound." The bells came closer without anyone driving them. A gray ewe appeared first, its wool crusted with snow. More sheep pressed behind it, shoulder to shoulder against the sage. They had approached from the exposed slope and stopped where Clara's goats had been gathering since autumn. The animals had chosen the same protected ground. A shout broke through the storm. Two ranchers emerged from the whiteout higher on the slope, pulling against a rope tied between them. One started directly toward the sheep. Clara raised both arms. Come around the ridge, not over it. They are 10 yards away, he shouted. The wind is stronger above them. Follow my rope. The man hesitated until a gust knocked him to one knee. Then both ranchers descended toward Clara and reached the hollow from the sheltered side. Our south barn lost a door. One said, we could not hold the flock. How many? 30, maybe more. The low shelters could hold Clara's goats. They could not hold 50 frightened sheep besides. Snow was already building across the open spaces between the four roofs. If it packed solid, the entrances would close together. Clara pointed to the brush Elias carried. Lay it from the outer corner of shelter 1 to the ridge. Keep it low. Leave a hand's width beneath the branches. One rancher stared at her. That will not make another building. No, it will make the wind pass over them. She sent the second man to clear the rear vents from the lee side. Elias moved the fraying guide rope away from the stone edge, while Clara opened a narrow trench between shelters 3 and 4. The sheep followed the goats' bells and crowded into the spaces between the roofs. Clara used the brush bundles as low wings, not walls, turning the drift away from the entrances while leaving enough space for air. The first rancher began stacking brush too high. Take the top layer down, Clara ordered. We need more cover. We need air more. This time he obeyed without argument. Another gust swept the exposed slope. Above the ridge, something wooden struck the ground and vanished into the storm. In Clara's hollow, the surviving red ribbon trembled against its frozen stake, but did not pull flat. She followed that small movement to the western edge and found snow curling into Shelter 4's entrance. With the short shovel, she cut a channel downwind. Elias and the ranchers removed the loosened blocks by hand. Warm air rose through the opening. Bells sounded beneath the roof, 6 familiar notes, close and steady. Clara moved from shelter to shelter, touching backs and reading the numbered marks on the bell straps. 6. Elias repeated it. 12. The ranchers passed the count along. 18. At Shelter 4, Clara reached through the brush screen and found the lead doe's bell. 24. All 24 goats remained sheltered. Beyond them, the missing sheep had settled into the protected trench instead of scattering. Their owners knelt beside the brush barriers, maintaining Clara's vents exactly as she directed. For the rest of the night, no one asked whether the shelters were too low. They asked Clara where to dig, where to place stone, and which drift could be trusted. By dawn, the wind weakened enough for shapes to return to the valley. The upper pen stood open, its gate gone. Farther across the foothills, tall barn doors hung broken or lay half buried in the snow. Clara's shelters had disappeared almost completely beneath the drift. Only the vent markers and the old red ribbon showed where they stood. Then the goats began emerging one by one, warm, quiet, and alive. The ranchers watched them climb onto the white ridge. None offered applause. None made another joke. One man took a willow stake from beside the ruined upper pen and carried it toward the place his sheep had chosen. "Show me how low to set it," he said. The thaw came slowly. For 3 days, water ran from the shelter roofs in narrow silver threads. The buried entrances widened. Stone walls appeared beneath the melting drift, dark with mud but unbroken. All 24 goats remained healthy. The sheep that had crowded into Clara's hollow returned to their own claims once the roads opened. Their owners came back before the week was over, not with praise prepared, but with shovels, willow stakes, and questions. They met beside the ridge where they had once watched Clara build a wall no higher than her knee. One rancher paced off the distance between the stone rise and Shelter 1. Another knelt to study the rear vent. A third tied wool to a stake and waited for Clara to tell him whether he had placed it correctly. "You set it too high," Clara said. He lowered it to the height of a goat's shoulder. The ribbon pulled sharply. Clara moved him 4 yards closer to the ridge. The wool softened. "That is where I start?" he asked. "That is where you watch." Elias stood beside the men with his hat pushed back. He carried the frozen notebook beneath one arm. The oilskin cover had split along its edge. Several pages were swollen, and the binding had torn where Clara had grabbed it from the snow. The charcoal marks from Thomas's last morning had bled into the newer storm record until the two weather patterns nearly touched. June had laid the pages beside the stove and dried them one at a time. Now she sat on an overturned bucket with waxed thread, pulling the binding together through holes Clara had made with an awl. "Will it still be your notebook?" June asked. Clara looked at the stained pages, the torn cover, and the new thread crossing the spine. "Ours, if you keep the marks true." June stopped sewing. "I can write in it. You already kept the count that brought me home." The girl bent over the book again, but her smile remained. Clara opened the repaired notebook to a clean page. She showed the ranchers how to record ground wind separately from wind at a man's shoulder. She explained why a low roof needed rear ventilation, why entrances should face along the ridge instead of toward open country, and why snow could protect a shelter only if air still had somewhere to pass. No one interrupted to tell her what real barns looked like. Elias placed his own willow stake beside the hollow where his sheep had gathered during the storm. "I will build my first shelter there," he said. One of the ranchers glanced toward the higher ground. "That low?" Elias looked at Clara before answering. "Low enough for the sheep, high enough for air, and exactly where they chose." It was not an apology, but it carried more weight than one. The men spent the afternoon measuring drift lines and marking places on their claims. Clara did not keep the knowledge behind her fence. She walked with them, corrected their angles, and made each man wait long enough to see what the ribbons did before he lifted a shovel. Near sunset, June carried the notebook to the ridge. The old red ribbon remained frozen and frayed on its willow stake. Half its threads were gone, and mud had darkened the end that had once been bright. June tied a fresh strip beneath it. The new wool fluttered once, then settled nearly still while the grass above the ridge bent beneath the wind. Across the foothills, men were already placing short stakes where their sheep and cattle preferred to gather. Clara watched June record the direction, the hour, and the movement of both ribbons. Before the next storm, the valley watched where the goats stood,